Hello, and welcome to the second lecture in this series for beginners and laypersons. Why Constructivism? My name is Vladimir Miletic. I am a psychotherapist and a life coach, and a medical doctor, as you can see. But kind of listing these sounds very pretentious to me. In this second lecture, we will be talking about this idea of a construct. It's something that people talk about all the time. They will tell you that gender is a construct, that race is a construct, that this is a construct, that is a construct. But the word is used so vaguely that it's kind of hard to understand what that is. Today, I'm going to try and make it more precise for you. By kind of focusing on one theory in particular, which is my kind of constructivism. And hopefully by the end of this lecture, I will try to be quick as well. Hopefully by the end of this, let's say, relatively short lecture, you will have this basic understanding of what a construct is. If you want to, this will be more about our psychology, about individuals. If you want to understand societies, we will, at some point in this series, have a lecture on what we call public constructs in this specific form of constructivism that I follow. But this can also give you a general idea. My point being is that here we will focus on individuals. And in a later lecture at some point in the future, we will talk about what public, societal, cultural constructs are and how they operate. So just keep that in mind. If this doesn't answer all of your questions, this is the basis. And then later on, we will build on that basis. Right now, for this initial series of lectures, my idea is to outline how we constructivists see psychology and how we envision persons and what kinds of possibilities of change we can offer, and why I think constructivism is unique and offers more than other psychological approaches. So my focus right now is the individual. So this is what we will be talking about. First, I will tell you a little bit about George Kelly, who created a theory called personal construct psychology or personal construct theory. It's the type of psychology that I practice and live by, just so that you can get the context of what we're talking about. And then I will present his idea of what a construct is. I will tell you a little bit about relationships between constructs and about constructs and experience. These last 2 points we will elaborate a little more in the next lecture. The next one will deal with the constructivist idea of a person and of personality. That one will be a little longer and perhaps contain some more intriguing and practical ideas. This lecture, I hope it doesn't sound too abstract, but introducing what a construct is by definition is slightly abstract. I will do my best, though. So first of all, let's spend some time talking about how we cannot find high-resolution pictures of George Kelly. I'm just kidding. That's not what we'll be talking about, but it is very frustrating, and it is an issue. Like, look at how pixelated this is. Anyway, George Kelly was an American psychologist. He was a professor of psychology at Ohio State and Brandeis. I think that's where he was when he died. He built a theory called personal construct theory. He published this 2-volume book. Well, it's not a book, it's more like a mountain, called The Psychology of Personal Constructs. If you're a psychologist or a mental health professional or a philosopher, I highly advise you to read it. It is a brilliant piece of psychological work, but it's not very easy to read or to understand. I have been reading it for years, and every time I read it, I find some other layer that I haven't discovered before. Here, because this is a lecture series that is not meant for constructivists, I will try to present his ideas in the most basic, ordinary language I possibly can. but his writing is quite technical, so I'm bound to leave something out. If you are a constructivist, please don't come for me. I don't have the patience. I also like to nitpick theoretically. It's just that the target audience for this is people who want to get to know constructivism, not people who want to be scared of it. So even though he invents an entirely new language to talk about the human psychology, I will try to make it not scary. In the I think in the preface or the forward, in the preface to his book, he wrote this. He wrote, in this book, there is no ego, no emotion, no motivation, no reinforcement, no drive, no unconscious, no need. So basically what he does is right from the very start, he kind of does away with the entire language of psychology, the language that psychology used not only in 1955, but that it uses today. He says all these are ways of dividing humans, of chopping them up into little bits and pieces, and he wasn't interested in any of that. What he was interested is, I apologize for the noise. It's normally very loud because I'm recording, otherwise it would be quite peaceful. What Kelly set out to do with his personal construct theory, which I will call PCT from now on because it's a bit of a mouthful, what he set out to do when he created PCT was to make a theory that would be not so much a theory of personality in general, but a theory that will help the therapists figure out each person's own theory of their own personality. He liked to say that it's not so much a theory as it is a meta theory. It's a theory that gives us the method to understand how we see ourselves. So it's a theory that doesn't tell you what's normal, what's not normal. It doesn't care to tell you what's disordered. It doesn't care to tell you how you should live your life like, or what you should be like. It tries to understand where you are, what your actual lived experiences are, and then it helps you find your own path forward. So whatever it is not a conformist theory. It's not a theory that is interested in putting you into any kind of a pre-made box. For clients, this is awesome because no one is going to try to convince you that your beliefs are irrational. Instead, a constructivist is going to try and figure out what's the logic behind your beliefs, because nothing comes out of thin air. There is no such thing as illogical and irrational. There's just logic that we do understand and that we don't understand. So for the clients, this is really awesome because you get a therapist or a coach that actually tries to see the world from your point of view. You know, on the other hand, there are constructivist therapists aren't numerous because it's very anxiety inducing. When you work from a standard CBT kind of standpoint, let's say, or even from a more philosophical standpoint, like psychoanalytic or some other type of psychology, you usually have rules. Either you have a whole protocol, like first you do this, then you do that, then you do that, or you have this ready-made theory of psychopathology that tells you, well, this is what's wrong with you, and here's how to fix it. Constructivism does not give you any of this. So a therapist has to be a very grounded person, someone who is very clear about the method, who understands theory, and who isn't afraid to venture into the unknown, which I have to say is not too many of my colleagues. I have a lot of respect for my colleagues. We do, work that's not very easy, but most of them like to feel safe and secure because the job that we do is very responsible. Be it as a coach or as a therapist, you are responsible to be present, to know what you're doing at all times. And constructivism, while giving you wonderful tools, doesn't really tell you what the destination is. So if you're insecure as a therapist, you might become quite anxious. As a client, on the other hand, you feel like you can be you and that you can be seen, or at least ideally, that's what you should feel. So that was Kelly's intention, to create a theory that wouldn't tell you what you're supposed to become, but instead to give you tools to become what you want to make of yourself. He himself had a very eclectic background. He actually didn't have a bachelor's in psychology initially. He studied mathematics and physics. Then he studied education, and then finally psychology. And then he ended up with a PhD in psychology. And this, I think, is really wonderful because he shows some brilliant out-of-the-box thinking. He created his theory the way that Euclidean geometry is structured. So you have your postulates, and then you build from them. He tells you, here's where we start. This is what we accept. This is what we find to be obvious. And then he builds from there. So if you're a nerd like I am, and if you like to get entangled into complicated systems of thought, he is really just wonderful to read. To me, I know I warned you against reading him. This is because most of my colleagues, when I enthusiastically recommend Kelly, they, respond with a WTF. So in that sense, he's not for everyone. But if you enjoy discovering new worlds, reading Kelly is truly, truly a joy. So just to wrap it up so that I don't digress forever, that was his point. Like, PCT is meant to give you a way to understand a person's experience in their own terms. So that's what it's about. And dispensing with all this ego, id, superego, motivation, reinforcement, drive, yada, 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 was his way of doing that. He said, we'll throw all this away because all these are constructs that are imposed by psychologists onto their clients, and they're not how their clients see themselves. Most people don't go around saying, oh, here is this source of motivation, or this is a source of reinforcement for me. They do in some pop psychology way, because they kind of adopt the terms, but they use them in very idiosyncratic terms. So Kelly wanted to create a way of looking at people from their own point of view. And for him, a construct as a kind of unit of our experience was exactly the way to go about this. Because then everyone can have their own constructs. What he needed to do was develop a technique and a theory around it that would help you map out other people's constructs. So for him, a construct replaces this kind of mountain of psychological terms. In that case, it's really beautiful because a construct in itself contains all of this: emotion, motivation, reinforcement, drive, unconscious, need. We really don't need any of these terms in constructivism, and you will see in the next lecture how that operates, because we have this notion of a construct. But before we dive into the definition of a construct, let me give you a few things about PCT more widely so that you know where to situate it. If you listen to the first lecture, which talked about constructivism in general, this will be familiar, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I just want to give you a reminder. So from the point of view of PCT, this is not a purely relativist and solipsistic theory that doesn't think anything exists. So external reality exists. It's just not knowable to us outside of how we construct it. So we have no immediate access to objective reality, or at least we cannot make, or at least in order for us to behave or do something with that reality, we need constructs as intermediaries. Even your senses have some kinds of constructs. Go back to the lecture number 1 if this sounds like a weird idea, because if I remember correctly, I dealt with it a little bit, and we will talk about it in one of the future lectures as well. Here's a quote from Kelly. He said the following: I sketched an epistemological position that assumed the reality of events independently of how they are perceived. So what he says basically is that even though we cannot know what things are in and of themselves, they are something, right? It's just that without our constructs, it appears very vague to us. I wear glasses, and if you wear glasses too, and if you are as visually impaired as I am, when you take off your glasses, you see this very fuzzy world. And you can't really tell things apart until you put your glasses on, and then suddenly everything becomes sharp. That's how you can think of it. When when we don't have constructs, when we remove our glasses, we see a world that is almost without properties. Like when I take off my glasses, people don't have faces anymore. And then when I put on my glasses, suddenly they get faces. However, my glasses always skew the color a little bit or the shapes. Some glasses, some lenses are sharper, some not as much. Some will kind of favor certain colors and block out some others. And this is exactly what constructs do as well. They give shape to reality, but at the same time, they exclude some things or they overemphasize some things. Another way to think about them is as if they were baskets that we use to classify events that we encounter. Every basket is attached to certain meaning, right? So in PCT, constructs are guides for action. So the reason why we have them is so that we can act in the world. I hope this is clear. So we never get to know objective reality. We always have to have constructs that give shape to reality. And then also constructs give us meaning, and meaning tells us what to do. So ultimately, constructs are there not so that we can intellectualize things infinitely. They're there because they have a very practical function to perform. They tell us what to do, how to think, what to say, how to act, which decisions we're supposed to make. Here's overall how that operates. Let's start with the top circle here. So first, an event comes into your field of awareness. I know this sounds very vague, but something shows up. That's what it means. It's just a little bit of constructivist lingo for you. Let's say you see a person in the street, right? As that person, you see someone in the distance. You identify them as a person. So as soon as they're identified as a person, they become an element of a construct. Because you know what a person is. There's a basket in your mind that's called a person. And then as this person is approaching you, they may get into these kind of sub-baskets of a specific type of a person. And then let's say if you're me and you like to walk around and take pictures, and let's say that for you, like for me, this is just a way to, I don't know, almost informally meditate, to just walk around and kind of connect to your environment. I like to do that on the beach, and I love to walk. I'm fortunate enough to live close to a beach, so I can walk for miles and miles, and usually I don't see anyone. But when I see a person, even in the distance, I immediately get this idea that I'm supposed to somehow avoid him. I'm usually not afraid of people, and I'm not socially anxious. It's just that when I go to the beach, this is me time. I don't want to chit chat. I don't want to meet people. I don't want to make eye contact. I don't want to be anything in particular to other people. This is time just for myself. So when a person shows up, they become an element in a construct that I have. And then I assign some meaning to these people, judging by how I just spoke about them. If you think about what I said, you can kind of see that I see people as trouble when I'm on the beach, right? Constructs are always context dependent. In constructivism, context rules everything, right? So if I see when I work with my clients, I obviously don't use the same constructs because constructs operate in specific contexts. On the beach, when I see people, I think, oh, this person is going to just ruin my peace or their trouble of some kind. So I'm just going to, I don't know, dive into my book or walk faster or change direction or go swimming, right? That's the guide for action. The meaning is this person is trouble. And then I will take some action, usually so that I don't have to chit chat with them, especially if they're tourists and they ask for directions. So I will take action to avoid kind of interaction. I'll go swimming, or I will open up a book, or I'll put my headphones on. That's my favorite. So it's because of what this person means to me that I will undertake some actions, but not some other ones. So meaning leads to action. Then when I act on the construct, I evaluate my action, right? And when I evaluate my action, I may decide that this construct works well and then keep it, or it might have to be changed. So that's how it works. When elements appear, we put them in a construct, and then that construct tells us what to do with these elements. An element can be a person, a thing, an event, your thought, a feeling. Very frequently, people get very anxious, for example, when they have certain thoughts. In constructivism, when we think of anxiety as not having appropriate constructs for something, which means that you cannot make sense of that something. There's no meaning to be assigned. And then that also means that you don't know how to act. There's also no appropriate action to take, which is why anxiety is for most people so difficult. Like if you feel guilt, you know you're not supposed to do something again. If you feel sadness, you know you're supposed to mourn a loss, or you can just let yourself cry. But if you feel anxiety, you usually don't know where to go. And if you think about it, that's because there's no meaning to be assigned, because you don't have appropriate constructs. Right. So that's how it operates. We will have, again, a whole lecture on emotions. So I will teach you how to look at emotions from a constructivist point of view. This was just an example. So I hope that through this you understand how constructs operate. So you need an element to come into the field, into a construct. Once an element becomes tied to a construct, it has a meaning. Once it has meaning, it leads to action. Action may lead you to reevaluate the construct itself. This kind of ties your constructs to your lived experience, which means that even though we get to invent infinitely many wonderful constructs of the world, only some of them will work. Because ultimately you have to take action in this world of some kind. You have to say something, do something, and so on. And that will tell you whether your construct makes sense or if it doesn't make sense. So a construct is an abstraction of our previous experiences. It's everything that has happened to you. We don't keep experiences, we don't put every experience that we have into a separate box. This would make our psychological life very difficult to manage, extremely difficult. Imagine if you had to find meaning in every new thing that you do. If you had to look at every person you see as being a new, completely different, unique person. That would make for a very fragmented world. Our minds have these storytelling abilities that we always use, so we look for patterns. We abstract our previous experiences, and then we carry those experiences as constructs. So that when we encounter similar situations or similar people, we can activate those constructs, we can draw on those previous experiences, and then help ourselves. A formal definition, also one more thing I would like to add here. A construct is really not a mental thing. It's not a cognitive thing. Constructivism is not a cognitive theory. First of all, it's older than cognitive theories. And second of all, it simply is not a cognitive theory because a cognitive theory implies the mind-body distinction, which we don't have in constructivism. For us, mind versus body is just one more construct. It's just one more way in which you can think of a human being. But because we like to look at humans holistically, we can say this construct is sometimes useful, but then sometimes isn't. We have a lot of these areas where mind versus body isn't a very good construct. You have, for example, somatic illnesses that are triggered by psychological events. So they're both biological, body-based, but they're also mind-based. They're also caused or triggered by your mind. So there are many events that concern ourselves that cannot really fit in very neatly into this mind versus body thing. So for us constructivists, we will use mind and body as terms when they make sense, but we don't really think of ourselves as being mind versus body. We are whole, and that's about it. constructs are neither mind nor body. So don't, I say an abstraction and people immediately think logic, cognition. It's an abstraction in the sense that it gathers certain themes that we've accumulated through our experience, but our experience is at the same time about thoughts and about emotions and about our bodies. It encompasses all that. A construct is a holistic thing. A formal definition of a construct is this second bullet here. It's a way in which two things are alike and at the same time different from the third thing. So in other words, I know it's a strange definition. In other words, I'm just giving you snippets of constructivist language here. In other words, to have a construct, you need at least 3 elements. 2 elements to form a binary, a polarity, because constructs always have 2 poles. And then a third element to position itself in the construct. So how do we come up with these binaries, with these polarities? We do that by observing repeating themes. All right. So when you're old, you use your existing constructs to kind of give birth to new ones, to transform the existing ones. But think of a baby here, because this is much simpler. A baby will cry or it won't cry. Like something will feel pleasant or it won't feel pleasant. That's how we start to create our constructs. Maybe an early construct, of course, we can't know since babies don't speak, and so they cannot verbally articulate their constructs. And construct words are just elements of constructs. A construct is not a verbal thing necessarily. Some constructs are symbolized by feelings, images, music, objects, whatever. So a baby cannot speak, but let's speculate a little bit. A baby can have a construct, for example, that says feels good, feels bad, right? And this is a very easy theme for a baby to recognize because its body is either calm or its body is excited. So that would be like a basic way of doing it. And then as we grow up, as we acquire language, we have much more sophisticated distinctions that we make. And of course, our lived experiences will direct and influence how we make these distinctions. It's important to note that one construct alone does not produce meaning. One construct is just an abstraction of a repeating theme that we can observe. For meaning to arise, we need a hierarchy of constructs. In other words, we need more than one construct, and we need them to be organized in a system. And indeed, when we think about a person, we think about a system of constructs. So I will show what that looks like as well. But before, I want to show you what's the purpose of noticing these themes and formulating these constructs. So we have some past experiences that are abstracted into constructs, right? So constructs just kind of are these distinctions that we can make between things. We live in the present, which is such a deep thing to say, isn't it? But as we live in the present, our past isn't necessarily relevant. However, it is relevant when an event presents itself and we have a ready-made construct for it. Then this aspect of our past experiences suddenly becomes alive again, becomes the present, because we use a construct to make sense of what's happening to us now. And then we use this construct to predict what will happen in the future. And it's through this prediction that we will decide what to do. Right? So the past lives in the present through constructs, and it helps us shape our future because we anticipate each construct is a polarity, so it's binary. It means that every construct can generate at least 2 predictions. And then based on these predictions, based on these anticipations, we will decide what to do. So this is how constructs operate through our actual lived experience. Think of someone who has experienced trauma, for example. Or let me give you a slightly maybe less heavy example. My dog is terrified of cats because when she was a puppy, she was attacked by a cat. So now whenever she sees a cat, she will either jump on me so that I carry her, or she will hide behind me so that the cat doesn't see her. This is because presumably my dog anticipates that she will be attacked. So she has two options, either to go there and be attacked, or to hide behind her owner where she feels safe. And then she chooses what makes her feel safe. So my dog anticipates based on her past experiences. Humans, while they might have more sophisticated and complex anticipations, kind of operate on a similar level there. Here's an example of how a construct may operate. I said a construct is a binary, but that doesn't mean that you have to be either on one end or the other end. A construct is, you can think of it as a scale. Here's good versus bad. This is a construct that most people use. It's not necessarily particularly relevant, but it's a cultural distinction that we all know experientially how to utilize. So on one end of the spectrum, you have the good, on the other, you have the bad. And then you have all these elements that fall within the context of that construct. And all these elements figure in somewhere. Some things are very good, some things are very bad, some things are kind of in between, right? Some things are more good than they are bad, some things are more bad than they are good, and then there are some things that are straight up in the middle. And these things, when they're really just in the middle between good and bad, then you have a very hard time deciding on what to do. If something is more good, you can side with the predictions or the action that goes with interactions with good things. If something is very bad, you do the opposite. But if something is right in the middle, that just means that the construct doesn't work for that particular event. This is where you might feel indecisive or even anxious because you have a construct, but it's really not very useful for you, right? Luckily, and we will talk about this in subsequent lectures, one element is not always confined to one construct. I mentioned people and the beach. At the beach, I see people as trouble because I want to be alone. But when I work, people are not trouble. They're these human beings who are suffering or have problems, and I'm supposed to help them. So there's someone that I see as my allies because we're on the same journey. Like I have the skills to help them and they have a problem and then we have to work together. So I don't see them as someone to run away from, but in fact, someone to move towards. But this is because I have a different construct as a therapist and a different construct as a life coach. So one element, a person, in this abstract sense right now, can be a member of different constructs in different situations. Yeah, so that was just my point. That elements are not distributed in a black and white way usually. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, but they don't have to be. And then that every element can also belong to other constructs as well. Constructs can be more or less possessive, let's say, put it that way. When a construct is extremely possessive, we tend to think of a person as being just one thing and nothing else. It's kind of like when you encounter people with very severe prejudice towards someone, and then they say, well, he's just X and nothing else. That's a very possessive construct. They're not able to see that person with any kind of nuance. They just trap them on one pole of one construct, and that's it. Okay, so you might be wondering, how do you find constructs? When you talk or when other people talk, pay attention to the adjectives they use to describe themselves and other people. Is someone annoying or wonderful or powerful or trouble, as I described people on the beach? Is someone in need of help, and so on. So just pay attention to how they describe other people, especially those adjectives or groups of adjectives that repeat themselves. Because remember, when we go hunting for constructs, we always go hunting for those themes that repeat themselves. Repetition doesn't have to be verbal. You can feel something around certain people, and that can be an indication that all these people are construed in the same way or at least similarly. They can be images, they can be body sensations. Like, for example, when we fall in love, we feel butterflies in our stomach. So you can make the case that butterflies in your stomach symbolize a construct. And frequently, when we look at the people we tend to fall in love with, when we put them next to each other, we can see that they share certain traits. So you can see what the element of the construct is. And whenever you identify one aspect of the construct, you always have to ask yourself, what's the opposite of this? If I have butterflies in my stomach when I'm falling in love, for example, and this is one pole of a construct, I always have to ask myself, what is the opposite? For me, and this is just me speaking personally, if butterflies are an element of being, of kind of falling in love with someone, and that's what they symbolize, the opposite for me is a kind of a superficial pressure that I feel in my stomach, like almost like a thickening, like muscles are becoming tense. I see that, I visualize that almost as a wall between me and another person. So for me, the opposite of I'm falling in love is I want to distance myself as much as possible, right? So that's also one way to think about it. It's not just words. I used good versus bad previously just because it's easier to understand that way, but constructs can operate like this as well. This is what Kelly says. Man, also, he means person here, but this was written in 1955 when language wasn't necessarily gender sensitive. I just didn't want to, I wanted to quote him verbatim. So he says the following: man develops his own way of anticipating events by construing, scratching out his channels of thought. Thus, he builds his own maze. So he thinks of constructs almost as a maze. Like his runways are the constructs he forms, each a two-way street, each essentially a pair of alternatives between which he can choose. So you can think of constructs as being a maze or a runway. I think a runway is a really cool way to think about it because you reach these intersections where you have to choose whether to go left or right. However, I said that in order for us to have meaning, we cannot have just one construct. One distinction is not enough. We have to have a whole system of them. Thinking psychologically about a person as a complex network of highways isn't very easy to look at. So I will show you a better way, a better metaphor to think about constructs in a person and also a society. But we're talking about persons. I want to give you a real life example though. This is, I have permission to share this with a client, although I won't, there are really no private details to share. So this is a client that came to coaching. And the reason why I'm using a coaching example and not a psychotherapy example is because people, when they come to coaching, they tend to have more verbalized complaints. And the way that we work is maybe a little different. So it's easier. Coaching is more structured, let me put it that way. So my clients in coaching think differently than my clients in therapy do. So she came with the idea that she is not productive enough. Right. So being productive is kind of a common shared construct. So this construct definitely has this societal note to it, but for my client, it was also a very personal thing. So we talked about what does it mean for her to be productive? It means that you do everything flawlessly, that you're never late, that your to-do list is completed by the end of the day, and so on. So I asked for some kinds of ideas of who else is productive. And then she said, well, my boss is productive, but not as productive as I am. So you can see how we visually presented that here. I put my client more to the left here than her boss. And then she said, but the most productive person I've ever met was my mother. My mother is productivity itself. She was always able to work, take care of the house, take care of me, my siblings. She was always able to cook, clean, and everything, right? So this is not what her mother was objectively, or maybe not even how her mother saw herself, but it certainly is how my client saw her mother, right? From other theories, we might borrow a term now and say that she might have idealized her mother slightly. But when she thinks of productivity, the main element of that construct is her mother. So then we started exploring the opposite, because remember, you cannot really know what productivity means unless you know what's the opposite of it. And so I asked her, can you think of someone who is not very productive? And then she said, well, my husband is not very productive. But I said, okay, tell me about that. And she said, well, he's not very productive, but my husband is a different kind of a person. He doesn't really have to be very productive. He's an artist. He's not like me. So basically what she was saying is that my husband is the opposite, but he's not the extreme opposite. We also did this visually together, and she decided to place her husband slightly more on the unproductive side. Like, if you can see that at the time we didn't have this verbal label, so I'm not going to say it just yet. She said, okay, my husband is slightly to the right of the middle. So just teensy little bit unproductive, right? Then her coworkers, she also saw as being incredibly unproductive. And then her father was the epitome of what is unproductive. Her mother did everything. He would just come home from work, turn on the TV, drink a few beers, and do nothing, and just whine and complain and demand. So he was the exact opposite. And then when we found this extreme, I said, okay, if you take a look at yourself and your mom, how are you two similar but different from your father? What is it that you and your mom have that your father doesn't? And then she said the obvious, which is, yes, we're productive. And I said, okay, but then how would you describe your father? And she said, well, he was very negligent. And I said, would you say that your husband is also negligent? And she said, well, he's not really very negligent intentionally, but he can be sometimes. And I said, what about your coworkers? And she said, absolutely. They're just waiting to kind of do as little as they possibly can and then go home. And so I said, would you agree that then we couldn't say that we could say that the opposite of productive is being negligent? And she said, yes, that sounds about right. And so we took it from there. My client really didn't need to be more productive. She was on the edge of burnout as it was. And by verbalizing this construct, we were able to actually kind of, what we call in constructivism, reconstruct it. We were able to rotate this. Productive wasn't working for her because the way that it was defined, you could never be productive enough. So it was kind of a futile chase where you always end up feeling bad about yourself. On the other hand, she didn't want to be negligent because she would be just like her father or her coworkers, and none of these was a compliment because this was a very much unfavorable part of the construct. However, as we talked about this, she did say, well, yeah, my father did actually work. He was the one who financially brought in a little more because my client was growing up in the 70s. And even today, there's quite a bit of disparity between how much women are paid and how much men are paid nonetheless back in those days. And she said, yes, but my father did work quite a bit and he worked very long shifts. And yes, he financially kind of supported our family. And I said, so when he would come home, he would be just very much exhausted. And she would say, yes, but he was still negligent, which of course I wouldn't argue with because that's not my job. And I also agree. He was a father. And even though he was tired, being a father is a social role that carries some obligations with it. And I said, but do you think that his negligence may have had a good side to it? And then she said, well, him being negligent was just taking some time to rest. And then I asked my client, do you ever connect resting to negligence? And she said, well, I never rest because I feel guilty when I rest. And then she said, well, maybe that's why I feel guilty, because I feel like if I'm resting and relaxing, then I'm being negligent like my father, and I really don't want to be like my father. And we took it from there. And this was where we started trying to find an alternative way of looking at things. I suggested that there might be some ways to rest but not be negligent, to be productive but not to burn out. And then we kind of started looking for other alternatives. But for us to actually fully understand what it means to say I'm working all the time and I'm never productive enough, we had to go through this whole process and verbalize the whole construct so that we can understand the implications, why she chooses to work so much and why she chooses to define productivity in these impossible terms with standards that no one can meet. But productivity is a frequent, I will say in coaching, this is a frequent complaint. People often come and say, I'm not productive enough, or I'm burning out, kind of chasing after being productive enough. But negligent is not the opposite for everyone. For some people, it's lazy. For some people, it's a failure. For some people, it's I don't know, nothing else comes to my mind. For some people, it's kind of navel gazing. I'm trying to recall what people say because as a person, I don't really have this construct. So I have no personal experience to draw from. If I had to position myself, I'd say I'm reasonably productive, but I'm not the kind of a person who would say that sleeping or meditating or reading a book or walking on the beach is being negligent or lazy or any of these things. To me, this is a necessity. It's a need like food, right? So that's how a construct looks like in a real life example. I promised a visual metaphor on how to look at a person and how to organize a system of constructs. And here's how to imagine it. This is what works best for me, and this is what most constructivists that I know of envision, which is like a pyramid. The higher up you go, the more important the construct is. Right. So for my client, the one who had the construct productive versus negligent, that was pretty high up in the pyramid. So these constructs here on the base would be easily replaceable, not as important. And these would be hard to replace on the top and very important. And what I said about one construct not being sufficient for things to have meaning, when you have these peripheral constructs, they're always connected to those constructs that are higher up. So as we kind of follow the chain, we always get to the top of the pyramid, which means that at some point, even minor things can become a matter of life and death. They can become a matter that endangers our self-image or our identity, and so on. We'll talk about this in the next lecture when we talk about how we conceptualize a person. What is the constructivist theory of personality? Today, I just wanted to explain what a construct is, so that when you hear people use this word, you're able to better understand what they mean. One obvious example is, for example, when we talk about gender these days, we talk about kind of altering the gender binary or people who don't want to position themselves on the male versus female construct, or who want to be able to move around or position themselves where they feel comfortable. So that would be an example of precisely these operations, just on a societal level as well. So why do we have these constructs? It's because they help us navigate the world. They arise from our experience, and then in turn, they shape our experience, because we think, feel, and act within the boundaries of what our constructs allow us to do. They are in constant motion. If you remember last time, we talked about constructivist worldview being very fluid in the sense that the world is always changing. So our constructs always have to change, because the distinctions that you've made in the past may not operate today, because they are abstractions of a world that may no longer exist, right? So when we talk about past traumas, for example, you have this at work. You have certain constructs that arose from very, very distressing and difficult experiences that are now being used in a world that is not as dangerous, for example, or applied to people that are not as threatening. And the person sometimes knows this, but still cannot change the way they behave, which is what I was kind of saying, that constructs are not words. They're not cognitive. They're all at the same time. We have this ability, this feeling that we're stable as persons, because not all of our constructs change all the time. And when they do, they don't change at the same pace. Is there anyone else who would like to drive by recklessly today while I'm recording this. This person changes at a very high pace, and if they hit a wall somewhere, their experience cycle will abruptly end. So speaking of experience cycles, constructs undergo what's called an experience cycle, meaning that every time we act based on our constructs, we're testing them. So we're verifying whether these old experiences work for us. If they don't work, we revise the construct. If they work, we keep the construct. If the construct doesn't work, but we continue to use it anyway, then we have a symptom. We have a problem. That's why people come to therapy or coaching, right? Even without psychotherapy or all these other ways of changing yourself, your constructs would still change because change is inevitable. In PCT, there is no world where change doesn't happen. It's always present. Everything is always evolving, always changing. So how we make sense of the world kind of has to evolve. The difference between going to therapy or coaching or doing any kind of introspective structured work is that when you do that, you change intentionally. You become what you want to become, or as close to that as is possible in your current circumstances, instead of being passively shaped by the currents of life. So if you were wondering about why is it that we need to put these constructs into words, why do we chase after them, why do we try to understand them, so that we could change intentionally, that's the answer. You will change without that as well, but this is only a matter of choice. Do I want to direct my change, or do I want to let the world just toss me around? Do I want to give up on my agency, or do I want to use it actively? So that's all that I had for you today. Our next lecture that will come out in about a week is called The Person in Constructivist Psychology, or in other words, we're going to talk about PCT's personality theory. Thank you for sticking around. I hope this was useful, and I hope you have at least a little bit more clarity about what a construct is after this.